Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 on this Tuesday, the 22nd of October. I'm Douglas MacKenzie, bringing you stories from Scotland and around the world. To discuss what's behind those stories, I'm happy to be joined by a regular contributor to the programme, William Duguid, writer and blogger, and a Wheel Kent face in the Perth Yes Hub. Welcome back, William.
Oh, thank you. And good to see you again, Douglas, as well.
Thank you. We start tonight, as we always do, with the update from Ukraine on this day 972 since Russia's full-scale invasion of the country. Russian President Vladimir Putin will meet the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres on Thursday to discuss the Ukraine conflict, according to the Kremlin, in what would be the UN chief's first trip to Russia in more than 2 years. The meeting is apparently scheduled to take place on the sidelines of the BRICS summit in the central Russian city of Kazan. Guterres has previously criticized Moscow's war on Ukraine. Ukraine's foreign ministry said meeting Putin now does not advance the cause of peace. A Russian missile attack on the southern city of Zaporizhia killed 2 people and injured 15 in the city centre, while causing huge damage to civilian infrastructure, including a kindergarten and more than 30 residential buildings. It would be a dangerous and highly concerning development if North Korea was sending troops to help Russia in Ukraine, the US said on Monday, as South Korea and the UK warned of the high price Moscow would likely have to pay Pyongyang. South Korea has summoned the Russian ambassador to protest in the strongest terms about the reported dispatch of thousands of North Korean troops to help Russia in its war against Ukraine. The UK is to lend Ukraine an additional £2.26 billion to spend on weapons as part of a wider US $50 billion loan programme expected to be confirmed by G7 members later this week. The loans will be repaid using interest generated by the $300 billion of frozen Russian assets held in the West. Dozens of US representatives from both the Democratic and Republican parties have urged the Biden administration to toughen sanctions on Russian oil shipments and questioned an exception issued to the world's largest oil field company, SLB, to operate in Russia. Volodymyr Zelensky said on Monday the US was preparing an aid package worth $800 million for the production of Ukrainian drones. The Ukrainian president said the package was in addition to $400 million for arms announced as the US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin visited Kyiv. Zelensky, however, is seeking more, asking Western allies to invite Ukraine to join NATO and let it use Western-supplied longer-range missiles to strike military targets deep inside Russian territory. Ukraine is having difficulty holding back a ferocious Russian campaign along the Eastern Front, having to give up a series of towns, villages and hamlets. It faces a hard winter after Russia targeted its power grid. Ukraine has called for foreign support to stop Russian strikes on its Black Sea ports after a series of fatal attacks, including on Odessa. Visiting Turkey, Andrei Sybiha, the Ukrainian foreign minister, said strikes in recent weeks had damaged 4 civilian vessels. Sybiha said he and the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan had discussed safe navigation for shipping in the Black Sea. We'll rather focus on the military side there, William. It does seem significant that Guterres is going to the BRICS meeting in Kazan and has turned down the opportunity to take part in the Ukrainian-sponsored peace talks for next year, which the Ukrainians are understandably hopping mad about. What's your take on his decision-making there?
Well, it must have some significance, that's for sure. We don't know for sure what line he's going to take on Thursday, whether this is a rapprochement with Russia or whether he just wants to call Russia out. So it might be as well to wait until Thursday to see what happens with that. But you can see why the Ukrainians are not pleased about this, because it does look as if he's treating the two sides in a different way. BRICS is a big thing for Russia because obviously it's Russia showing that it has got lots of friends, and of course in trade terms it certainly does, even if they're not unanimous about support for Russia in the war. And so, in a sense, Guterres is always also giving some credence to that. Right now, it does look pretty grim for Ukraine going into the winter because having had some success earlier in the year, they're now in really quite a lot of trouble on the eastern side of things, and also in the Crimean ports, etc. And any deal done now is going to be quite difficult for them because they don't really have, I think, enough territory really to bargain with. So I think on Guterres, it's a wait and see, but it's not necessarily going to help things along. I would tend to agree with Zelensky in that, but I'll hold my judgment until we've seen what the communique says on Thursday.
Yes, I mean that sounds reasonable, but I mean it has been very noticeable that Guterres has been very keen to call out atrocities in Gaza and the killing of innocents and breaking of humanitarian law, and has been far more reluctant, it seems, to do that in Ukraine.
Yes, I would say that's potentially true. The rationale between having the talks now would be perhaps to address what the UN will see as one of a number of flashpoints in the world and try and calm things down, because there must be considerable concern in the UN right now about the overall world situation with theatres of war opening up everywhere. But this is not necessarily the best way to do it, I would suggest.
And yes, okay, and speaking of flashpoints, time to move on to the Middle East update now. At least 42,718 Palestinians have been killed and 100,282 injured in Gaza since 7th of October 2023, according to a statement by the Gaza Health Ministry. At least 63 people were killed in Israeli strikes on Lebanon over the last day, bringing the total death toll to 2,530, the Lebanese government said on Tuesday. It also said that more than 11,800 people had been wounded by Israeli strikes on Lebanon since October 2023. At least 18 people were killed, including 4 children, and 60 were wounded in an Israeli strike on Monday near Beirut's main government hospital, the health ministry said on Tuesday. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, meeting with US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, said there was a need for a security and political change in Lebanon that would allow displaced Israelis to return safely to their homes. Gaza's economy has been left in, quote, utter ruin by the year-long war between Israel and Hamas, and it would take 350 years to return to its pre-conflict levels, the United Nations has warned. In a report on the economic costs of the war, prepared by its Trade and Development Wing, UNCTAD, the UN said the fighting since Hamas killed more than 1,000 Israelis on 7th of October last year had devastated the remnants of Gaza's economy and infrastructure. Lebanon will need $250 million a month to help more than 1 million people displaced by Israeli attacks. Nasser Yassin, the minister in charge of responding to the crisis, said today ahead of a conference on Thursday in Paris to rally support for Lebanon. He said the government response, helped by local initiatives and international aid, only covered 20% of the needs of 1.3 million people uprooted from their homes and sheltering in public buildings or with relatives. The FBI is investigating the leak of a pair of highly classified intelligence documents describing Israel's preparations for a retaliatory strike on Iran, the Washington Post reports. The French government has defended its decision to bar Israeli companies supplying the wars in the Middle East from exhibiting oil at an upcoming trade fair outside Paris. Sir Keir Starmer and his deputy, Angela Rayner, met a network of British Palestinians for the first time today to hear calls for an emergency child evacuation scheme, Palestinian resettlement scheme, and tougher measures to break Israel's blockade on aid. Foreign Office Minister Annalise Dodds has said no UK arms exports are now going to the Israel Defence Forces, as she sought to clarify the significance of the UK government decision in September to suspend only 30 of the 300 arms export licences to Israel. The Lebanese Red Cross said 3 paramedics have been injured in an airstrike on South Lebanon while on a rescue mission coordinated with UN peacekeepers. Well, the news from all parts of the Middle East just seems to get worse and worse. And in the face of such horrors, it seems callous to talk about a strategy. But what on earth does Israel think is going to get from this? I mean, surely creating chaos wherever it goes is going to simply increase the power of terrorist organizations in the future. You would think the only way that Hezbollah could be controlled in Lebanon would be if there were a strong and stable Lebanese government. This just seems to be flailing in all directions and causing untold harm to everyone.
Yes, I would tend to agree with that. There is no lasting peace brought through constant destruction on all sides, and you make new enemies rather than solve anything by that sort of action. And from the looks of it, Anthony Blinken's talks with Netanyahu have not gone particularly well from a US perspective. I was just glancing at some of the headlines just before we came on air, and I think the US must feel that to the extent that they felt that Israel might be biddable in some way to perhaps roll back or just not be quite so brutal, although it's such a ridiculous scale to be talking about. That doesn't seem to be happening at all. And I think it's connected really with the fact that Netanyahu's political future depends on constant conflict. And that's what we're getting right now. The long-term strategy for Gaza looks as if it's completely to depopulate the place. If you look at the report that says 350 years to return to pre-conflict levels, I don't think the Israelis will see that way. They'll see that as a place to settle once all the Palestinians are out of there, and they will pour resources into it. But it's not genuine security for them. They don't have a future with any sort of security the way things are going. And so, from that perspective, rather than Netanyahu's short-term political perspective, it's unfathomable. And I think it's still pretty well supported by the majority of people in Israel, but I think there must be growing numbers even there who are uneasy about the future. And certainly the Jewish diaspora, which is far from unequivocally Zionist, there's a lot of unease now, and I think that's growing. And one can only hope that that has some sort of influence where perhaps the American politicians can't.
Yes, one hopes so. I mean, traditionally, it's always been America which has made the difference, and perhaps the election will have a difference to the line that they take. But
well, that's another big question.
Well, indeed, yes. Of course, it depends who wins, and then how they see the lie of the land. So it's another one which sadly is a wait and see while many more thousands are killed or removed from their homes. The economy now, and the UK economy will grow faster than previously thought this year, according to an upgraded upgraded outlook by the International Monetary Fund in a boost to the Chancellor Rachel Reeves ahead of her first budget next week. In a significant revision of the Washington-based organisation's biannual economic review, UK growth in 2024 is expected to be 1.1%, up from a projection of 0.7% in July. The IMF's forecast for 1.5% growth next year was unchanged. Reeves, who is due to join finance ministers and central bank governors on Thursday at the IMF's annual meeting in the US Capitol, has made economic growth the centrepiece of Labour's plans over the next 5 years. The IMF said in its latest World Economic Outlook report that nations such as the UK that depend on services had grown strongly this year. Pierre-Olivier Augurnichas, the IMF's chief economist, said Europe was on a steady and improving path, but growth remained lower than in the decades leading up to the 2008 financial crash. He said the global economy had remained unusually resilient throughout the disinflationary process of the last 2 years, when central banks raised borrowing costs to calm spiralling prices. Meanwhile, a cross-party group of 30 MPs has urged Rachel Reeves to impose a wealth tax on the UK's richest in next week's budget, rather than announce spending cuts that would hit the most poor the hardest. In a letter to the Chancellor, the MPs, including the former Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn and his then Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell, say she could raise £24 billion a year from a 2% tax on wealth above £10 million and lay the foundations for a fairer, more sustainable economy. The signatories from Labour, including Diane Abbott, all 4 Green MPs, the Liberal Democrats, Plaid Cymru, the Social Democratic and Labour Party, and the Alliance Party of Northern Ireland, as well as independents, argue that wealth is undertaxed in the UK, and a new levy on the rich would generate a large stream of revenue. The letter coincided with the release of 2 polls showing a majority of voters would back an increase in wealth taxes to raise money for repairing the UK's crumbling public sector. 6 in 10 people thought the government should prioritise raising more money through inheritance tax reforms over cutting public spending at the budget. And a separate poll of more than 3,000 adults by Opinium, commissioned by the Trade Unions Congress, found 62% of voters were in favour of asking those with the broadest shoulders to be asked to pay more taxes. Well, the most popular taxes are always the ones which fall on other people. I mean, I think that's a fairly straight political point. There's also the suggestion which was made by various think tanks earlier that a tax on the wealthy would simply drive them out of Britain or drive their funds out of Britain. Do you think it's a realistic strategy?
From a moral perspective, it's justifiable in the sense that the redistribution of wealth that's happened over the last 40 years has been overwhelmingly in favour of the rich. From a practical perspective, there is the possibility that you would drive people away, but I would presume that they would be replaced by other people who might be more amenable to paying taxes. So you can look at it either way, I think. Whether Rachel Reeves is going to go for a wealth tax, I very much doubt, because I don't think she sees it as something that's going to necessarily, whatever the polls may say about people approving of it, I don't think she's going to see it as something that's going to sustain them in power for a second term if that happens. So I think she's more likely to be looking at things like inheritance tax if she's going to be increasing taxes at all. What I do fear is that a lot of the correction for the so-called black hole, and black holes seem to be appearing all over the place at the moment. We hear different and ever more frightening figures about how black these holes are. But the action that she might take would be, in my view, entirely the wrong one, which is to be cutting public spending further. We absolutely need to have public services properly funded, and to do so actually puts money in the hands of working people, and that is what gives you growth, because they will spend their money. Rich people will stash it away somewhere. They will not spend it. So I very much hope that whatever she feels she needs to do to address this black hole, and there are those who question the need to either do it at all or certainly do it all in one go. But whatever she does really has to be focusing more on redistributing wealth from the rich to the poor and not cutting public services. That's what I would say about it.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem counterintuitive to talk about a policy of growth and then say, but yes, but we're not going to invest any money into the growth.
Hmm. I think that's a fair observation.
Thank you. Staying with British politics, and SNP MP Seamus Logan has presented a bill in the House of Commons today, which, if passed, would keep the NHS in public hands. The bill is a response to the Labour government Health Secretary Wes Streeting making repeated threats to open up the NHS to the private sector. Mr Streeting said he would hold the door wide open to private healthcare firms, while it was revealed that the Labour Party accepted millions in donations from a hedge fund linked to private healthcare interests. Amid the Labour Party's freebie scandal, it was disclosed that Mr Streeting personally raked in £175,000 from a donor also linked to private healthcare. At the start of the general election campaign, Streeting promised in the Telegraph that "we will go further than New Labour ever did. I want the NHS to form partnerships with the private sector that go beyond just hospitals." Previously, private healthcare investors said the Labour Party would kickstart private sector investment much more proactively than the Tories were able to do. As part of their manifesto, the SNP made a commitment to moving a bill to prevent the NHS being sold off by the Labour government to foreign healthcare firms. The bill will explicitly stop any UK government undermining the principles and protections of the NHS as part of any future trade deals. SNP Health spokesman Seamus Logan MP is inviting MPs from all parties to support it. Commenting, Mr Logan said, "Our NHS must remain in public hands, not the private sector, and while the Labour government may want to hold the door wide open to private healthcare from abroad, the SNP will fight to keep it firmly shut. That's exactly what this bill will do." We made a manifesto commitment to bring forward a new law at Westminster to keep the NHS safely in public hands and bind the hands of the Labour government to ensure that remains the case. Any MP who values our NHS should be right behind our bill today. We will stand by the founding principles of the NHS, keeping it free at the point of delivery and keeping our health service where it belongs, in public hands. That is what putting Scotland's interests first looks like, and I urge Scottish Labour MPs to join us and back the bill. Well, fair enough, it was a manifesto commitment, so it has to be done, though one doubts that it's going to meet with much success. But is the danger not that if, of course, I mean, health is a devolved responsibility, so Scotland can say, well, we will prevent certain things happening. But if the UK government is cutting funding on health by expecting the private sector to put money in, that will have a huge effect on differentials, will it not, for Scotland? And that surely is the big risk, rather than this, which you might say is a little bit of grandstanding.
I'd agree with you in almost all respects there. The big danger for Scotland is that the Barnett consequentials dry up because of the private money going into the English NHS, and that therefore, in order to keep the NHS in Scotland going, the Scottish government simply has to use some private money simply to stay in the race. And that's always been the problem with the whole devolution settlement when you start talking about privatisation. Now, it could be an incoming Labour government in Scotland would absolutely welcome private finance in just the same way as Wes Streeting. But that is the real danger that we have, I think, in terms of the NHS. I would also say, yes, it's a manifesto commitment, and I think it really probably is grandstanding because it's what's known as a presentation bill, which doesn't have any speech attached to it, doesn't get debated, doesn't even have to be printed, although it won't get to a second reading unless it's printed. Somebody needs to pick the bill up and run with it, and I mean somebody with numbers in the House of Commons, in order for it to have a chance of getting anywhere. And I don't therefore think it will get anywhere. And what it does enable Seamus Logan to do is to challenge Scottish Labour MPs to back his vision of how things should be for Scotland, which of course they will not do. And to that extent, grandstanding though it may be, it's a worthwhile political tactic. The only problem being that it's liable to be picked up on broadcasters such as Broadcasting Scotland and not to be touched with a barge pole by the BBC and all the other big guys. But manifesto commitment, nice try, and nothing, I'm afraid, will come of it.
Thank you. I fear you're spot on with that. Now, the Save the Children organisation has called on the UK government to protect child-related benefits. Chancellor Rachel Reeves is facing calls to introduce a child lock to protect spending on child-related benefits in the autumn budget, a move campaigners say would dramatically reduce the number of children in poverty. In a report to be shared with the Treasury and Ministers this week, Save the Children has called for a guarantee that benefits for supporting children are raised each year in line with inflation or average earnings, whichever of the two figures is higher. The proposal is modelled on the pensions triple lock, which has been committed to by successive governments and protects pensioners' incomes by ensuring state pension payments are raised annually in line with either inflation, average earnings, or by 2.5%, whichever of the three is the highest. Save the Children says a lock on child-related benefits could result in 80,000 fewer children living in poverty at the end of this decade. If that were coupled with scrapping the two-child benefit limit and overall benefit cap, 400,000 fewer children would be living in poverty in 10 years. No wealthy nation that is intent on growth can continue to have a child poverty rate this high. Child poverty is not bad luck. It is driven by systemic failure and political decisions, said Megan Meek O'Connor, the child poverty policy lead at Save the Children UK, who authored the report. The two-child limit introduced in 2017 restricts support through universal credit or child tax credit to the first two children in a family, while the benefit cap, introduced in 2013, limits the maximum amount in benefits a working-age household can receive. The new government's approach to tackling child poverty, particularly its stance on keeping the two-child limit in place, has caused disquiet among some in the Labour Party. Sir Keir Starmer faced the first rebellion of his premiership after 7 Labour MPs voted in support of a Scottish National Party amendment to scrap the two-child benefit limit. In March, the Department for Work and Pensions said 4.3 million children in the UK were living in poverty. Analysis from the Child Poverty Action Group, released earlier this month, found at least 10,000 more children had fallen into poverty since Starmer took office. Save the Children said the introduction of a child lock, alongside scrapping the two-child limit and the benefit cap, would cost the Treasury £6 billion a year by 2034 to 35, just over half of the annual cost of the pension triple lock, which costs £11 billion annually. Well, they've said that it will take 800,000 children out of poverty, but if the cap is withdrawn, which seems virtually impossible given what has preceded it. But I mean, what does strike me is that, right, there were 7 Labour MPs who rebelled, which might be the left wing of the party, if such a thing still exists. But Save the Children is not exactly a radical, rebellious, take to the streets kind of party. This is very much the voice of, what we say, Middle England. So does it make a difference in a call coming from them?
I would be surprised if it made a difference, particularly if you're starting to talk about things like the two-child limit, which Labour seem pretty well bound to keeping in place. And what they got was a small rebellion that was, well, manageable, because they basically withdrew the whip from some, and Rosie Duffield resigned from the party. I think there is going to be more mainstream comment, though, about child poverty, which is quite ridiculous in an economy such as the UK's. And although I'm sure Rachel Reeves isn't for spending £6 billion on anything right now, she's more likely to be trying to rein back on that sort of spending. Again, this sort of outlay is not just dead money, it's an investment in people who will spend it. And the benefits of spending it don't just reflect in the growth figures themselves, but the quality of life and the developmental requirements of the children are better met by not being entrenched in poverty. We seem to be going backwards to the Gradgrind Dickensian years with some of what we're hearing about child poverty right now, and it's quite ridiculous to have it in this economy. So I think there's a case certainly for the child lock. I think you might get the child lock because the triple lock has been very successful in terms of the UK pension. It's still rubbish, but it's better than it was, quite significantly so. It's got some way to go to be up with other European pension schemes, but it proves that that kind of mechanism does work. And so to do that, I think that might be something that would be seen as a good response. But you won't get the other things that will really make the difference. That's the big problem, and we need to go far, far further than Labour seem willing to go just at the moment. And goodness knows how long it'll take to get the economy in the shape where they think they can afford it.
Thank you. Pessimistic, but no doubt quite accurate view. A new report by Santander has found that almost a third of UK businesses are calling for the UK government to support trade by reducing Brexit-related regulations and red tape. 31% of companies said they wanted to see a reduction in post-Brexit regulatory requirements, including customs procedures, obtaining appropriate licenses for trading, and strengthened mutual recognition of professional standards and qualifications across Europe. The Santander survey follows on from the Treasury being forced to admit that the UK has already paid the EU £23.8 billion as part of its financial settlement agreement, and will pay a further £6.4 billion at a time when the Chancellor has said the UK is facing a £22 billion black hole in the economy. On top of those cuts, a study by the Centre for European Reform in 2022 also found that UK government tax revenues would have been around £40 billion higher on an annual basis if the UK had remained in the EU, around the exact amount that Rachel Reeves is seeking to plug in spending cuts and tax rises at the UK budget. SNP Westminster Europe spokesperson Stephen Gethens MP said, "This report confirms what we already know. Brexit was a disaster, it remains a disaster, and its impact on our economy is getting worse." Ahead of the UK budget next week, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor need to wake up to the fact that the biggest black hole facing the UK economy remains Brexit. But it seems the new Labour government is still politically too afraid to even mention it. So Keir Starmer has spent a lot of time talking about a reset with our EU partners, but the reality is that the only reset which will work is to, at the very least, rejoin the EU single market and the customs union. That is the only way to escape the self-imposed damage that Westminster has inflicted on our business and wider society. A hard Brexit was a political choice, and it was the wrong choice. Austerity is a political choice, and it's the wrong choice. Scotland can't keep paying the price for Westminster's damaging choices. That story really quite stunned me, William, could make news out of the fact that if you leave a club, it actually costs more to do business with the members of that club than if you stayed in it. I mean, similarly, standing in Amsterdam airport earlier this week and watching the non-Schengen queue of British passport holders waiting over an hour to get through, while fortunately having an EU passport, I went through in 5 minutes.
Yeah. Brexit is a disaster, but because the changes in regulations were introduced slowly, it becomes a kind of rolling disaster, so that each level of disaster becomes normalized before you get to the next. And it's only when you do a survey such as Santander has done that you find that companies are not enjoying it one little bit and that it's constraining their performance. I'm surprised it's only 31% that seem to want a reduction in the post-Brexit regulatory requirements. Um, I suspect that 31% were not expecting to have quite so much red tape, since Brexit was supposed to be all about cutting red tape. But what on earth are the other 69% doing? Are they sort of backs to the wall and struggling, or are they getting on with it, or what? It's the weirdest thing. But all and a little voice in my ear suggests they may not be exporting. Wonder if they ever had any ideas that they might want to export, however, and whether they're being discouraged from doing so. So yeah, it would be very interesting if you took a poll of the same electorate now about Brexit, because I do think there would be majority support for, at the very least, as you say, a return to the single market, and perhaps freedom of movement would be good as well. But that's going to be very tough to get past the politicians. But popular support for that, I think, would be there. But which government will have the guts to go for it in the UK, and when? Could it be 10 years away? Could it be further? Who knows? But honestly, the UK cannot keep doing this sort of thing to itself. And Stephen Gittins is quite right. Scotland certainly can't put up with it and needs to start looking seriously at the alternative. And you don't need me to tell you what I think the alternative is.
Indeed, thank you. I can guess. Yes. So a Scottish story now, and specially trained public order officers will again be deployed during bonfire night to protect local policing teams from attack. As part of Police Scotland's Operation Moonbeam, existing resources across Scotland can be supplemented with public order officers whenever they respond to fireworks offences taking place. Since Operation Moonbeam was first launched in 2018, the number of criminal incidents involving fireworks has decreased. However, last year, officers responding to reports of disorder and antisocial behaviour in certain parts of the country were subjected to unprecedented levels of aggression and violence. In total, 62 officers sustained a range of injuries after being struck by or in the proximity of a firework that was thrown towards them. This year's Operation Moonbeam was launched today at a joint event on Glasgow Green alongside Crime Stoppers and the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, who also launched initiatives aimed at deterring the criminal and reckless use of fireworks. Assistant Chief Constable Tim Mayers, Gold Commander for Operation Moonbeam, said, "What we saw last year was an unacceptable level of hostility and violence, which was primarily directed at police officers and for the most was instigated by adults linked to organised crime, who provided young people with fireworks and other weapons and encouraged them to attack others. Safety and well-being of those who were trying to keep communities safe." Significant investigation was undertaken in the weeks and months that followed, and numerous people were charged in connection with these incidents. I want to make it clear that those responsible for endangering the lives of police officers, other emergency service workers, or members of the public will be identified and they will be brought to justice. In the event you avoid being caught on the night, you can expect a visit from us once we have conducted our inquiries. So yeah, a strong call that they will catch up with people breaking the law, but would it just not be simpler to prevent the sale of fireworks, except
There is a
to
case for it.
good organisations.
Yeah. If fireworks become community events that are run by the community rather than in the hands of a bunch of individuals, that would probably cut the problem down significantly. And we might get there one day. The good thing is that Operation Moonbeam did have initially a good effect from 2018 onwards in reducing the number of incidents, but last year seems to have been a bit of a peak. And it goes to show that in terms of public order, things really are a bit rubbish. And not only police officers being attacked, but emergency services being attacked. And presumably, much of the time, there'll be the fire brigade trying to put out fires that might have been caused by fireworks or avoided by not having them. I've never been a great one for fireworks, and you shouldn't let me near lighting one. I'll never get out of the way in time. So perhaps I'm biased here, but I do think there's a case for public displays and being genuine community events, and then we all go home and we've had a good time. It's been much more professional and decorative to the sky than our own feeble efforts in the back garden. So yeah, I would agree with you. Let's just move that way as a society.
Yeah, it doesn't really seem to be a basic human right, does it, to be allowed to set off a firework?
Afraid not.
Okay, now leading Uyghur activist has accused the Labour government of falling behind its allies in failing to stand up to China after ministers backtracked on plans to push for formal recognition of the country's treatment of the minority group as genocide. Speaking after David Lammy's first visit to China as UK Foreign Secretary, the human rights activist Rahima Mahmood, who has lived in exile in the UK since 2000, said she had hoped there would be a shift in UK policy once the party came into power, including following the US in declaring a continuing genocide in Xinjiang. The Conservative governments all those years had big words but very little action, said Mahmood, who is the UK director of the World Uyghur Congress. She has long campaigned against the crackdown on Uyghurs, which several governments and human rights bodies have described as a genocide. But sadly, after Labour came into power, I didn't even hear big words, she added. I am very, very disappointed. The community is very disappointed. Since 2017, China has swept an estimated 1 million Uyghurs and other minority groups into internment camps, which it called training centres. Hundreds of thousands are believed to still be incarcerated, and in many cases, families have no idea about the fate of relatives who had been detained. Lamy held high-level meetings in Beijing and Shanghai last week during his first visit to China as Foreign Secretary, as ministers seek to improve engagement and build closer economic ties. Before the visit, the Foreign Secretary was under pressure to take a tough line with his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi on a range of human rights issues. A statement after the meeting said Lamy discussed the mistreatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang in China's far west. Mahmoud, who has been unable to return to her homeland, speak to family members, and whose brother was held in a camp for 2 years, said the government needed to take action. She called on the UK to follow the US in labelling China's actions as genocide and stopping the import of goods made through forced labour in the region. In 2021, an independent and unofficial tribunal led by Sir Geoffrey Nice KC said Uyghurs had been subjected to genocide by China, while the UN concluded the following year that China's actions could constitute crimes against humanity. Last week, the European Parliament passed an emergency resolution censuring China's repression of the Uyghurs and calling for the release of detainees. Well, it does seem that Britain is lagging behind other parts of the world who themselves are not doing all that much other than being dismayed and making statements. But is it a case in the UK that it's economic desires trumping human rights and moral considerations?
It may well be. To a certain extent, it's unfathomable. Um, I think the most damning statement that you read there was from Rahima Mahmood saying that the Tories had given her big words but little action. But Labour couldn't even manage the big words, and yet they could manage the big words in opposition when they backed a Commons motion a number of years ago to seek um, formal recognition of the treatment of the Uyghurs as genocide with the UN. And last week, when asked about it, a spokesman said, genocide is a determination for competent international courts to decide. Well, yeah, I know that. It has a definition. But the idea was, to them, years ago, it met the definition. Now that they're actually in power, it's backtracking. And I think it may be economic considerations, as you said, but it may also be that Labour would say anything that they needed to get into power. And now they're in power, we just see on so many fronts backtracking, which is absolutely shameful in my view, but pretty much par for the course, I'm afraid. And one last thought. Maybe they're not too keen on having anything declared a genocide because that thing might then be compared with other things that they would then have to declare a genocide, and they certainly don't want to be doing that.
I think that's a very good point. To Austria now, where the parties are in coalition talks to keep the Freedom Party out of government. Austria's president has tasked the incumbent chancellor with forming a new government after the general election winner, the far-right Freedom Party FPÖ, failed to find a coalition partner to allow it to take power. President Alexander Van der Bellen told reporters he had asked Karl Nehammer, head of the centre-right People's Party, ÖVP, to begin negotiations with the centre-left Social Democrats, SPÖ. Van der Bellen said, Austria needs a stable government with integrity that is able to act, as he announced he had unusually selected the losing party to begin coalition talks. Nehammer's ÖVP has governed since 2021 in a coalition with the Greens, but both parties suffered heavy losses in the 29th of September election, in which the Eurosceptic, pro-Moscow, anti-Muslim FPÖ rode a wave of voter anger over immigration and inflation to a historic first-place finish. The ÖVP won 26%, and the SPÖ sank to its worst-ever result of 21%. The FPÖ's leader Herbert Kickl had insisted that his party, which drew 29% of the vote, should have the first crack at forming a government. However, all the mainstream parties represented in Parliament refused to work with Kickl as Chancellor, creating an impasse in the country. In a short speech at Vienna's Hofburg Palace, Van der Bellen said that leaders of the ÖVP and SPÖ had told him that concerns about Austria's democracy and the rule of law under any government with the FPÖ had made cooperation impossible, as well as its Kremlin-friendly stance and proximity to right-wing extremist groups. Together, the ÖVP and the Social Democrats would have a wafer-thin majority in Parliament. They will have to discuss whether to invite a third party, likely to be the liberal NEOS, which won 9%, to the talks in order to form a broader, more stable coalition. A difficult situation, William. You can see the far right saying, "Well, we are being excluded from democracy. Or people voted for us. We should get a go at it." And of course, no one wants to see a far right party in Austria. It was pretty bad when it happened before.
It was, and that is what makes this a slightly tricky one. How do you deal with a growing right-wing sentiment? That's really the question, because they didn't make a very good job of it leading into this election. The dissatisfactions that the population had that led them to vote for the Freedom Party needed to be better addressed. And I think they should really be focusing on that because I don't think people naturally are drawn to right-wing parties, but what they are drawn away from is parties that fail to give them what they are looking for. Now, somewhat uncomfortably, to a great extent, that was what was perceived as lack of control over immigration. And I do have issues with that, because I think over the next 20 years, widespread migration, particularly because of climate, is absolutely inevitable. And throughout the world, we have to work out how we can deal with that and live together. And it certainly isn't working properly in countries where you're getting this sort of election result. But is it the answer just to form a coalition that excludes the one that people voted for in the majority, particularly if you're bringing back the parties who did the things that made people vote against them? So that's a problem, and it needs to be dealt with. And otherwise, we're in a cycle where next time the Freedom Party will get more votes, and it'll be impossible to exclude them at some point. But deal with the underlying problems. That's the true solution to this. Because actually, most people are reasonable. They're not raving nutters. But when they vote for what I would term raving nutters, there has to be a reason, and you have to address it.
Thank you. Now a story about scientific research in Scotland. And a study on an essential mineral abundant in Brazil nuts could unlock the key to preventing the spread of triple-negative breast cancer, according to new research funded by Cancer Research UK. Limiting the antioxidant effects of selenium, an ingredient of multivitamin supplements found in everyday foods such as meat, mushrooms, and cereals, could be the secret to controlling this form of the disease. Triple-negative breast cancer can be hard to treat, but is often manageable through therapy and surgery, unless it spreads to other parts of the body, when it can become inoperable. Around 56,800 people in the UK, of which 4,900 are in Scotland, are diagnosed with breast cancer each year, with an estimated 15% of those being diagnosed with triple-negative breast cancer. The action of selenium, a key antioxidant, was assumed to be useful in fighting against cancer cells. However, this research shows that cancer cells need selenium, especially when the cells are sparse, away from densely packed cell clusters. Once packed together, triple-negative breast cancer cells produce a type of fat molecule containing oleic acid, commonly found in olive oil, which protects them from a type of cell death called ferroptosis, brought on by selenium starvation. This new research, published in EMBO Molecular Medicine today, shows that when triple-negative breast cancer cells are not clustered together, such as when they are moving to other parts of the body, they cannot survive without selenium. When the research team at the Cancer Research UK Scotland Institute in Glasgow interfered with the metabolism of selenium in these sparse cancer cells, they found that they could kill these cells, particularly those in the blood circulation seeking to spread to the lungs. Research led by Dr. Saverio Tardito of the Cancer Research UK Scotland Institute in Glasgow, now of the Centre for Cancer Research at the Medical University of Vienna, said, "We need selenium to survive, so removing it from our diet is not an option. However, if we can find a treatment that interferes with the uptake of this mineral by triple-negative breast cancer cells, we could potentially prevent this cancer spreading to other parts of the body." Well, William, a pretty difficult story to take apart. I mean, I'm still eating my Brazil nuts because it's supposed to be preventing prostate cancer, and there were studies as late as September last year saying that it has a major effect in hampering the growth of skin cancers of various kinds, squamous cell carcinoma in particular. So this is potentially conflicting evidence, or it's a step forward, one or the other, I don't know.
It's a step forward. It's a sign to the ultimate, it's a pointer, if you like, to the ultimate solution. The ultimate solution is not to starve yourself of selenium because you need it, but if they can find a way of making sure that cells don't absorb it, and that's where the revolutionary treatment will come in, and target particularly cells that are on the move and not clustered in a way where they can protect themselves against that sort of treatment, then you might be onto something. I think it's true to say that breast cancer isn't usually the thing that kills you, it's when it spreads to other parts of the body. And consequently, it's a good solution to try and interfere with that. And I would think probably it's one of the goals of cancer treatment generally. If you can stop it spreading, then you might well be on to something. My only question with the technique of starving the cells of selenium is how you target it, how you make sure it's only the cancer cells that get hit by it, because otherwise it would turn into a cancer treatment which has got severe minuses as well as the plus of killing the cancer, and that's the drawback to many cancer treatments. Nevertheless, it's a brilliant insight, and these things can produce solutions, I think, quite fast. And so it's reason to be cheerful. But for yourself, Douglas, I would keep eating the Brazil nuts because, well, good for
Thank you,
you.
Dr. Gould.
Yes,
I will do that. Indeed, no one would ever claim that cancer treatment was simple. But staying in Scotland, and SSEN Transmission, in partnership with councils and housing associations, is to support the construction of 1,000 new homes across the north of Scotland to provide housing for workers on the programme to upgrade the transmission network in the north of Scotland. The £20 billion investment in the energy network upgrade will help provide energy security and support plans to reach net zero by 2045. Workers' accommodation is required to deliver the proposed projects, and SSEN Transmission is aiming to create a legacy in the communities that will host its workforce by delivering housing that will support local need when the projects are completed. The scale of this delivery of new housing in local authority areas in the north of Scotland includes around 400 homes in Highland and a similar number in Aberdeenshire, and other significant housing activity is planned elsewhere across SSEN transmission areas. Further announcements with details of local housing projects in different council areas will be made in the coming months. Scottish Government Housing Minister Paul McLennan said, "I welcome the innovative approach being taken by SSEN Transmission to support the delivery of an additional 1,000 new homes across the north of Scotland. These homes will initially be for workers upgrading the local energy infrastructure to support Scotland's net zero targets and will support a longer-term legacy across the region. We will work with SSEN Transmission and other partners to ensure that the right homes are delivered in the right place to benefit local communities for generations to come. Good quality housing is essential to attract and retain people in our communities. We remain focused on delivering 110,000 affordable homes across Scotland by 2032, with at least 70% for social rent and at least 10% in our rural and island communities, supported by our Rural and Island Housing Action Plan." Rob MacDonald, SSEN Transmission's Managing Director, said, "Our commitment to support the delivery of more than 1,000 new homes in the north of Scotland reflects ongoing work led by SSEN Transmission, with the support of our contractors and partners, focused on finding workforce accommodation solutions that will provide a legacy for communities where the lack of housing for local people is a key issue. This is a significant and innovative contribution to addressing the housing challenges in the north of Scotland, and it also demonstrates how we can work in partnership to develop imaginative proposals that will deliver new homes and act as a template for other developers." I was reading about this, William, and Shetland Council, who not mentioned the initial report, were talking about the houses being handed back to the council at the end of the project and then being made available to local people rather than being sold as expensive holiday homes. It's a great good news story, but is it just too good to be true?
It'll probably turn out to be slightly too good to be true, but it's not a bad idea. If you have a difficult target to hit, 110,000 affordable homes by 2032 is a difficult target. You do need all the help you can get, and this sort of innovative approach is the likeliest to deliver it. Because we're a difficult species, we'll always find a way to mess it up to an extent. But this gives you the chance of having the houses that are affordable for people, that when the infrastructure workers no longer require them because the infrastructure is built, then they get handed back, and you can offer them to locals. You need to be having things to keep locals around anyway, though, as well. So it's if you like, half the solution. It is possible if you can't maintain the local population to an adequate extent that you end up with too many houses unable to use them. So it's a difficult balance to strike, but I applaud the innovation and good legacy, and yeah, more power to it.
Thank you. Let's remain optimistic and look on the bright side of all the benefits that it might bring. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. We face costs of over £4,000 every month, but only receive donations of around £2,500. We urgently need more regular subscribers, but we need to clear our debts as well. We're at crisis point and really need to increase our donations to be able to pay our bills and survive. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, and please donate whatever you can afford. So thank you very much to William Duguid for some interesting insights as always. And thank you to you at home or wherever you are for watching. Please join us again on Broadcasting Scotland tomorrow. From me, thank you and good night.